So, in trying to answer this question as to where exactly are we going to place this particular course, as we said, let us quickly go over. So, this will be a quick recap for all of us about what we just mentioned are the 4 pillars of economics as a subject. The first is microeconomics. Remember the first year in college as a student of economics, the first thing that we are required to do is a course in microeconomics. And what is microeconomics all about? To put it in very, very simple terms, as the term micro suggests. What does micro suggest as a term? Micro means small, right? So, here small is in terms of the unit, in the sense that when we consider an entire economy, the smallest unit of an economy is who? Is us as individuals, okay? And we as individuals, sometimes we are consumers and sometimes we are producers or sellers. So, we wear different hats at different times, but at the end of the day, we are individuals. So, this is what microeconomics is broadly all about. This is about how individuals take decisions in an economy. Few instances, so this should ring a bell. That is, we have all studied about consumer behavior. Remember, we had to do those optimization problems of maximizing utility subject to a budget constraint, and that would help us solve for what are the optimal bundles or optimal demand from a consumer. Similarly, we have also done chapters on behavior of firms, because firms are also considered as individuals or a very small unit in an economy. And from here, we were introduced to the concept of different kinds of market structures: perfect competition, monopoly, monopsony, monopolistic competition. So, all those things are a part of microeconomics. And in this context, some of you might have also done a course in game theory, which is about strategic interaction between individuals, right? So, broadly, these are the topics that come under microeconomics. The second pillar, and possibly the second course that you had taken in college or you have taken in college already, besides microeconomics, is macroeconomics. Again, what does macroeconomics signify? As the term macro implies, macro, the general meaning of the term macro is big. Okay, at the macro level, when we say big, not in sense of magnitude here, but big here means at the level of aggregation. So, in other words, how to make sense of an economy at the aggregate level. So, in microeconomics, if we were asking questions about how individuals take decisions, in macroeconomics, we look at factors, or we have come across terms like GDP or inflation, and you might have done the ISLM model, etc., and the fiscal multiplier, etc., etc. These all concern about how an economy functions at the aggregate level. So, broadly, those were the things that we cover in macroeconomics. Econometrics is another very important pillar of modern economics, and what it helps us to do is that it helps us to analyze various types of data. You see, it is one thing to study these economic observations and to study the different kinds of theoretical models that perhaps explain what we are observing around us, but at the same time, we should also know that what is the data telling us? Is the data supporting theory? Is the data negating theory? What kind of information are we getting from data? And in today's age, which is the age for data, right? Data is the next oil, as they say. It is very, very important to analyze data. And again, of course, there are various ways in which econometrics is done. There is classical econometrics, there is Bayesian econometrics. But at the core, well, what everyone is trying to do, they are trying to analyze data. And what kind of data? I am also giving a very quick introduction here, because later in this particular course, we will be looking at some data. So, the first thing is that when we look at data, we try to recognize that what kind of data am I looking at. What does that mean? That is, data can be in a cross-sectional format. What is a cross-sectional format? Cross-sectional means that at any given point in time, let's say we choose the year 2023. Okay. Now, in the year 2023, perhaps we are looking at what has been the per capita income across roughly, I think there are about 200 countries in the world, right. So, if we are looking at this kind of data, then this is known as cross-sectional data. There is another kind of data format which is known as time series data. As the term suggests, this is data over time. So, what kind of data that might be? So, let us say that we are trying to answer the question, what has been the economic performance of India in terms of per capita GDP since independence? So, see, in this case, instead of considering all the 200 countries of the world for one particular year, here we are considering only one particular country, which is India, and we are looking at its performance over the last, almost 7 decades since independence. So, this is known as time series data. Panel data is a combination of both cross-sectional data and time series data. Of course, it becomes more complex to handle this kind of data because it has both the dimension of time and also the dimension of different agents or different countries. We call it N by T, right. But at the same time, this also conveys a lot of information. So, imagine now we are talking about what has been the per capita income level of all these odd 200 countries around the world for the last 50 years. So, we are going to look at the per capita GDP of each country, of each of the 200 countries for the last 50 years. Okay. So, then our data, as we said, of course, it becomes more complex, so as to say, because we are handling a great amount of data, but at the same time it is also very insightful. So, what kind of econometric techniques we are going to adopt to analyze data depends on what is the format of our data. That is why I mentioned all these 3 different classes. So, for instance, there are courses, some of you might have done those courses. There is time series analysis, where we are taught how to analyze data that is specifically in time series format. There is also econometrics based on panel data, because the techniques that we adopt for panel data is going to be different from the techniques that we adopt for, let's say, cross-sectional data or time series data. Okay. So, that is why it is important to first understand and recognize the format of data before we can proceed with any kind of analysis, right. Okay. And the last pillar, last but of course not the least, is mathematical economics, okay, where we employ mathematical concepts and techniques in solving problems in economics. So, one instance that you might like to recall is the constraint optimization problem. Remember consumer behavior chapter, where we were maximizing utility subject to the budget constraint, or sometimes we maximize profit, maybe subject to the production function, or we are minimizing costs. So, these are all optimization problems, sometimes constrained, sometimes unconstrained. These are only some of the examples, and we employ various mathematical techniques in trying to solve for whatever question that we are asking ourselves. So, broadly speaking, these are the 4 very important pillars on which economics as a subject stands. Now, again coming back to our particular question, that where are we going to place course on economic growth within this particular kind of orbit that we have drawn for ourselves. Well, this course, it falls within the broad area of macroeconomics, right. And what kind of techniques are we going to use here? So, we are mostly going to employ the concepts that we have learned in basic macroeconomics, and we are of course going to take help of some optimization techniques, etc. So, broadly speaking, if one is wondering that what kind of course is this going to be on economic growth, this is a course, one can say this is falls within the subfield of macroeconomics. So, we are going to use macroeconomic concepts here, although modern day economic growth courses, if we do advanced level economic growth courses, there we will find a generous contribution of microeconomics as well, because most of the macroeconomic theory that we do has got microeconomic foundation. So, in that sense, this also has contributions from microeconomics, and as we said that we are curious beings, right. So, we are not always just satisfied with the different theoretical models that try to explain what is happening in reality. The next step is always to look around us and to analyze whatever data we have, and in data analysis, econometrics is of big help. So, if we would like to generalize, then yes, economic growth as a course, it falls within the broad area of macroeconomics, but it also employs the different tools that we learn not only in macroeconomics, but also in microeconomics. And if we go one step further and we are analyzing data, then we are also going to employ different econometric techniques. So, you see how it is an amalgamation of not just macroeconomics, but macroeconomics with mathematical techniques, with microeconomic concepts and econometrics as well. Now, as we said that this particular week, we are also going to devote to some very, very fundamental concepts, because unless and until these basic concepts are very clear, we would not make much progress with this particular course. Okay? And as we go over these concepts, every time we would also try to relate it with what we have already studied thus far, maybe in other courses in macroeconomics, and see that what are the questions that have been answered in other areas of macroeconomics versus what are the questions that we are going to ask ourselves here. Okay? So, in that, I feel that the very first fundamental concept that has to be absolutely crystal clear, especially to do this course, is the fundamental distinction between the short run versus the long run aspects of an economy. Now, how do we distinguish between the short run and the long run aspects of an economy, right? So, we are talking of an economy, right, or of a country, and a country has both aspects. Okay? So, before we go on to seeing how economics treats these two things differently, let us first try and understand it in a very laymanish way. Okay? Now, these are some of the analogies I came up with. These are analogies I have developed while teaching a class, but you are free to come up with your own examples as well. Now, think of like this. Think of a person, okay? It can be me, it can be you, it can be someone we know. Now, as a human being, we all have our general health status or a health profile, okay? So, let us talk of someone who might be 80-year-old now, okay? So, he has lived a good part of his life, and looking at his life, we can say, well, he or she is more or less a fit person, right? Now, when we see people, we do think like this or we do comment like this. What does this mean? Now, it does not mean that this person never fell ill or sick in his entire life. What it means is, for over the 8 decades that this person has lived so far, except for minor things here and there, by and large this person has been quite healthy. Whereas, there have been times maybe of temporary illness or maybe a small surgery here and there, but when we look at the overall health profile of a person, we say that this person is quite fit. Why are we talking about this? Because this is exactly the distinction between the long run aspect of an economy versus the short run aspect of an economy. So, just like the human being that we were talking about here, we are talking of the same person, okay? We are talking of the same economy, but there is a long run aspect of an economy. This is like the long run health status of a person versus a short run aspect of the economy. Like, someone maybe, falls ill for maybe 5 days, okay? So, that is quite possible, but otherwise this person is by and large quite healthy. So, similarly, an economy might be functioning very well, but there are times that maybe suddenly for a year or for a couple of years, maybe there was a recession and the economy was not performing that well. So, couple of more analogies like this. One is, these days we have semester systems everywhere, and when we get our grade sheets, we generally see 2 columns there. One is known as CPI or an equivalent of that. What it means is the cumulative grade point, right? So, maybe you have done courses over 8 semesters. So, there is a CPI that captures the overall performance for all these 8 semesters, right? Versus there is a semester specific performance, something like SPI, we generally call it here, of a student, right? Now, both the CPI and this SPI belongs to the same student, but they convey very different information. What is the SPI conveying to us? It is telling us how this particular student has performed in a particular semester. Maybe the SPI is around 9. So, the student had got a few A's and maybe a B plus somewhere, right? Whereas, if we are looking at the CPI or the overall cumulative grade point of the same student, we see, or we might see, a different number. And what would that imply? That would imply how for over these 8 semesters, the average performance of the student. So, you see how they are conveying 2 different information for the same student. Similarly, the point that we are trying to make here is that we are talking of the same economy. We are not talking of 2 different entities here, but for the same economy, there can be a CPI version, which is like the long run average, versus an SPI version, which is more short term in nature, okay? I hope this is making sense, and you are already thinking of examples that you can think of. As I said, I don't know how you are going to like these analogies, but these are things that generally come to mind when I teach. The other analogy I can think of is the distinction that we make between climate and weather of a particular place, okay? So, it might be sunny today, it might be windy tomorrow, but by and large, let us say, I am at Kanpur right now. So, here we would say that by and large, it is a hot place. Now, that does not mean that we don't never get rains or it is never cold. No, in the short run, we do get rains and it does get very cold, by the way, but the broad pattern is, it is generally very hot, right? So, these are the different, I hope I have been able to convey the distinction between the long run and the short run for the same entity, because they convey 2 different versions for the same thing. Similarly, for an economy, now we come back to our point after going through these analogies, and I hope you can add more of these examples, okay, for your own understanding. So, coming back to the economy, these are 2 screenshots that I am sharing with you here, that are the headlines that we sometimes come across in the newspaper, right? On one panel, and that is why I have highlighted it here, the keyword is recession, where we see that the headline is talking about UK recovering faster than expected after slipping into a technical recession, says the IMF. Whereas in the other panel, we see that the keyword is growth. This is from Economic Times, and the headline is driving growth, the impact of infrastructure development on economic prosperity in the Indian context. So, this is the point that we were trying to make here, that also when we read the newspapers maybe on a daily basis or magazines or going through any website where we are trying to understand how an economy is doing, there are two perspectives of an economy, and it should be very clear to us which perspective we are talking about, because accordingly we are going to ask the questions, and more importantly the answers will depend upon which perspective we are talking about. Again, going back to the analogies that I had given, why is this important? Because if by and large I say that, well, the weather pattern, or let us say that, the example that we gave, that a student is a fairly good student, let us say. Why are we saying that? That maybe the CPI is around 9. Now, that does not mean that this student never did badly in any course, right. So, there might be times or there might be courses where the student might not have performed that well, but overall the student might have performed, the average performance is very well. Similarly, here we see there are two terms here, one is of that of recession and the other is of growth, and both these terms apply to the same economy. Of course, the examples here, the headlines that I have given here, they belong to two different countries, but that is just for the sake of showing or mentioning the headlines. But these are two different perspectives for an economy. One is more short run in nature, and this term recession, which we will look into, we'll be elaborating a little bit more about that. This is more short run in nature, the term recession, okay. And the term growth or economic growth that we talk about is more long run in nature. So, you can think of long run growth as the aggregate performance or the average performance of a student, versus this recession is more like the short term performance or a very semester specific performance of a student. Again, why are we going over this? Because as we said, we come across headlines like this very often, and we should be able to distinguish between the two, because the causes can be very, very different, right. So, in order to find answers, we should first be able to distinguish between the two concepts, and only then we can proceed towards answers, right. I hope it is clear up to this point. So, first we talk a little bit about the short run perspective of an economy. Now, the short run perspective of an economy, we call it by different terms, okay. Sometimes we call it as cycles, okay. Sometimes we call it, to be more specific, these are business cycles, and sometimes we also call it as fluctuations in an economy. So, these are different terms that are used interchangeably at different times, but they all denote or imply the same thing. Well, what is the short run of an economy, or how does an economy perform in the short run? In the short run, there are fluctuations in economic activities. What does the term fluctuation mean? Fluctuation means what? Up and down, right? Sometimes it is up, sometimes it is down, pretty much like the Sensex. If you follow investment, if you follow the stock market, we know that the Sensex, some days it is very high, some days it just dips. This is the meaning of fluctuation, going up and down, okay. Now, the term that is more familiar and also dreaded in a way is associated with these fluctuations, and that is known as recession. Recession is a dip, and of course, it also has a technical definition, but the general understanding is when we talk of dips, quite bad dips in economic activities of countries, then it is known as recession. And the opposite of that are economic booms, because sometimes the countries do very well. Maybe there has been a sudden discovery of medicine, let us say, or maybe this new AI that people are calling is a new technology that is gradually taking over, that increases our productivity. So, maybe this suddenly enhances income of a country. So, again, as we just mentioned, just like the Sensex goes up and it goes down, similarly, the economic performance of any country or of an economy, sometimes it does very, very well. There are reasons for that, and sometimes it doesn't do that great, and these are times of real concern, and these are the times of recessions, as we generally call it, when there is a slowdown. Also, I would like to remind you, there is a very technical definition of recession. Every time there is a slowdown or a dip, it is not necessarily a recession, but we are not going into such great details here. The feature of these cycles or fluctuations being that these are unpredictable in nature. So, again recall the Sensex going up or down. I mean, maybe to some extent we can guess, at best we can guess, but we can never ever predict with 100% certainty that it is going to go up today or it is going to go down today. So, similarly, the fluctuations that we experience in economic performance, they are unpredictable. People can guess that maybe there is a slowdown, maybe things will become worse from here or better from here, but again they cannot be predicted with 100% certainty. That is a feature of cycles. And neither is it seasonal, like we cannot say that every year around this time, let us say here in India, every year around Diwali time, we generally purchase a lot of things, right? Consumer expenditure generally goes up. In Western countries, consumer expenditure generally goes up a lot during Christmas time, because that is their festive season. So, these are known as seasonal things, because every year we know that around the same time consumer expenditure is expected to go up. But the feature of cycles of fluctuations is that we can never predict that in advance. We cannot say that every year around the time of October or November, the economy is going to do very well or it is going to dip. So, this is also another feature, that this is not seasonal in nature. Naturally comes the question that, well, what causes all these fluctuations? Why does economic performance fluctuate? This is again a very profound question. There is an entire area within macroeconomics that deals with these kind of questions. But just to give a very short and quick answer to that question, fluctuations are caused by what we call shocks in an economy. What kind of shocks? Let us say, there is the housing market meltdown, or there is the financial market meltdown, okay? Or there is an oil crisis, as we talked of the oil shocks in the 1970s, right? So, shocks are sudden impacts, okay, sudden events. Again, they are shocks because no one could predict it is going to happen, right? So, when these kind of things happen in an economy, even the COVID-19 pandemic, in some sense, it is a shock because no one knew this is going to happen. Once it happened, we had no idea how long it is going to continue or what would be the impact of it, but it did have an impact on the economy, right? So, these are the reasons, that is, these are temporary shocks because of which economic activities fluctuate. That is just to give a very quick short answer to a very profound question.